let us first of all address perhaps the biggest question I think that I myself had when learning about the concept of idol worship. We hear about it even as kids. We're told about the famous stories with Avraham Avinu fighting against the false idols of his time, breaking all the idols in a shop that his father, where he sold different idols. So what bothers me, and I think many people, is in today's world, when we think about the concept of worshiping stones, it seems ridiculous, beyond foolish. And we might mistakenly conclude that our predecessors, the people of old, were brainless, or even if they could be anything less than that. I mean, hard for us today to relate to the concept. When you hear about the great Avraham Avinu, the father of our people, what was his main mission in the world was to fight against these false ideologies of idol worship, and he became the founding father of Judaism, which we follow in his footsteps. And today we continue in this overall responsibility in this world to direct the world, of course the Jewish people, but the world at large, to this loyalty towards God. And we say, well, what? I don't get it. Who would be dumb enough to worship idols? So let's first start by explaining really what we're not aware of, which is that once upon a time, meaning a long time ago, idol worship was not what we understand it to be today. There was a big change. In ancient times, the power and the allure, the temptation for idol worship was so strong that even the righteous people among those generations were sometimes caught up in its trap. They were pulled to the temptation. It was so great. And we're talking about even righteous people. Not to mention the average person, it was like Coca-Cola. Does anybody not drink Coca-Cola, have a cup of coffee in the morning? It's like everybody indulged in idol worship. If you didn't, you were like lost. You were, society really, when it gives something a license and its approval, then everybody, explores and endeavors into these type of things that are supposed to be okay, without even a second question, a second guess. So the average person of those times just completely took idol worship as it was 100% glatt kosher, without even questioning it. And that's because the original founders of the concept of idol worship were the ones that were chachamim. They were wise men, but they made some basic mistakes which got it all started. But let's right now first address the power that was behind it and the temptation. So for this, there's a story that's recorded in the Gemara that is very enlightening, and it'll help us appreciate how things might have been, or just a little bit back then. So one of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud period, Rav Ashi, who himself is accredited for actually writing down the entire Gemara. He's the one who gathered and collected and edited what we today have as what we call the Gemara, similar to the way Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the great, they call him Rabbi, organized the Mishnah. So many years later, there was a need to further explain the oral Torah, the oral tradition. And Rav Ashi was one of the greatest rabbis at the end of the period of Talmud, and he's the one who recorded for us the Gemara. So the Talmud records a story between him and King Menashe. King Menashe was one of the kings of Yehuda, the 18th actually king in order, and he was unfortunately one of the wicked kings. And he, along with two other kings, are recorded in Masechet Sanhedrin, in the Mishnah that talks about having a portion in the world to come. After mentioning that all Jews have a portion in the world to come, it then starts to exclude people that don't have a portion in the world to come. And stated there are the three wicked kings, Yeravam, Achav, and Menashe. In this discussion, Rav Ashi basically gets up to the Mishnah that's going to discuss the three kings. It's the end of the class, and he says to all of his students, tomorrow I'm going to start discussing about our colleagues. So all he does is simply refer to these three kings as their colleagues, him and his students, as if equating these three monarchs to him and his colleagues. So that night, Menashe comes to Rav Ashi in a dream to teach him a lesson, so to speak, because he felt it was out of line for even the great Rav Ashi, who called Rav Menashe a colleague. he said that wasn't appropriate because the kings of Israel in their time period were such great Torah scholars and on such a high level that it's not fair to compare themselves to him. So he opens up the conversation in that way. He says, you call yourself a colleague of ours? What basis do you have to compare yourself to us? So he asks him a very simple question in halacha. He asks him, where are you supposed to break the bread when you make hamotzi? Simple question. Everybody should know it. I guess in Menashe's time, everybody knew it. And to this question, Rav Ashi wasn't able to answer. He had no answer for the question. So he says, you can't even answer such a question and you call yourself a colleague of ours. So Rav Ashi said, okay, if you know the answer, great. So teach me this lesson. And tomorrow when I give my class, I'll give it in your name. And it'll be an honor to the king and a merit also to teach Torah in his name. So Menashe teaches him the lesson. Where do you break bread when you make hamotzi? You're supposed to bake it from the part that's cooked the most, from the part that's the most cooked. As a side point, the Ben Ish Chai explains that Menashe was really giving Rav Ashi a sign. He said that just like all of the souls of Israel, they come out into the world when they're ready, and the ones that came out earlier were ready first, so too, where you split the bread is the part that was ready first. To show that it has an advantage, it's more cooked, it's more prepared, so too the earlier souls that came out into the world are much higher, more prepared souls, and the ones that come later are considered to be on a lower level because they were prepared to come into the world later. That's what Ben Ish Chai explains on this, why specifically he chose a law of breaking the bread. In any event, after Rav Ashi learns this simple halacha, he is very puzzled and he can't help himself. So he then asks King Menashe, if you were such a great Torah scholar, you and your colleagues you and the other kings were such great Torah scholars, how could you fall prey to this, the most obvious sin, the second sin in the Ten Commandments, and a sin that disconnects a person completely from Hashem? How can you follow idol worship? How could you have followed idol worship in your times? So Rav Ashi so King Menashe answers him back and says, listen, if you yourself, we're talking about the greatest rabbi of his time, Rav Ashi, if you would have been alive in my time, you would have been chasing me to go worship those same idols. So don't be quick to judge. In those early days, the pull, the power in the allure to idol worship was 1,000-fold what it is today. Now, one will ask, where did this change come from? So the Gemara records in Yomah that the rabbis got together and realized that this Yetzer Hara, this evil inclination towards idol worship, is a beast. It's too dangerous and it's too hard to contain it. The people can't help themselves. They're all being pulled in that direction. So many we can't even imagine. Let's imagine today how many movies, for example, in Hollywood, produce subtle ideas which are borderline heretical, or borderline even on idol worship, or even just how much promiscuity and how much sin is filled in these movies. And now, how many people run to go see those movies every day, and they watch them again and again? So just take that as an example, and imagine if there was such a Yetzer Hara in the early times for idol worship, how many people were running in the masses to these houses of idol worship to worship them. In any event, the rabbis of that generation, the men of the Great Assembly, a very powerful collection of rabbis and prophets, all with Ruach HaKodesh, divine communication, got together and canceled the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. So from then onward, there was no longer the temptation. They reasoned that, why did God create this Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah? It's for a person to battle with it, overcome it, and only serve Hashem. But they saw the risk in failing so great, and so many people failing, they said, we don't need its challenge, and we don't need its reward. Better it doesn't exist. And they were given heavenly permission to eradicate that Yetzer Hara. So with this in mind, all what we said, we can appreciate and understand that our predecessors were not fools. They were actually very wise.